Wyoming Territory, November 1883. The wind howled over the frozen plains, and by the time she reached the cabin door, her dress was frozen stiff. Celia Janehart pounded her numb fist against the wood, chest heaving, breath rising in sharp clouds. Her bonnet had torn free miles back, her boots soaked through, and her heart beat louder than the storm behind her. Behind her lay a train wreck of a life, letters unanswered, promises broken, and nowhere else to turn. The door cracked open, flickering firelight spilling out, and a tall man stood in the frame. His shirt was half-buttoned, suspenders hanging loose over strong shoulders, and his dark blonde hair was mussed like he had just woken. His eyes, a stormy blue-gray, narrowed on her, then widened as he took in her state. "God Almighty," he said, stepping aside. "Come in, before you freeze solid." Celia stumbled across the threshold. The warmth hit her like a blow, and her knees buckled. The man caught her under the arms before she collapsed. "I am," she gasped. "Celia Janehart, the mail-order bride for Lewis Ellard." "That is me," he said, steadying her. "Lewis Ellard, you came all this way in this storm." "I had no choice. The conductor wouldn't let me stay on after Pine Ridge." "The stage never came. I walked." "You walked 15 miles through a snowstorm." His voice was low, unbelieving. "You could have died out there." "I nearly did," she whispered. He looked at her, then really looked. Her cheeks were red and raw, her dress torn at the hem, her hands trembling. She was soaked through, shivering so hard her teeth clacked. "I'll get you dry things," he said hoarsely. "And food, then we talk." He helped her to the fire, wrapped her in a thick quilt, then ducked into a back room. She stared around the cabin. It was plain but clean. A table made from pine boards, 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, a bed in the corner with a worn wool blanket. This was a man's place, built for one. He returned with dry clothes, his own shirt, far too big, and a pair of wool socks. He turned his back while she peeled off her wet things, modest even in the middle of a storm. When she sat again, he handed her a plate of hot stew and a cup of strong coffee. The food brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said. Lewis sat across from her, elbows on his knees, watching her with the careful stillness of a man not used to company. "I thought you'd changed your mind," he said quietly. "Your last letter came in June. I sent 2 more. I never got them. After my father died, my cousin took the house. She burned your letters, said I was foolish to leave Boston for a stranger." He nodded, jaw tight. "You still came anyway." "I had nowhere else to go," her voice cracked. "I would have married you sight unseen. I was ready to be a wife." "I still am." The wind screamed outside, but inside the fire popped gently. Lewis reached across the table and set his hand over hers. His skin was rough, warm. "I meant every word I wrote," he said. "I wanted a wife, not just for cooking and stitching and tending the home. I wanted someone to share the days with. I still do." Her breath caught. "I am not what I was then," she said. "I am colder, harder. Life has made me smaller." Lewis shook his head slowly. "You walked through a blizzard in the dark to get here. That is not small. That is strong." Celia stared at him, her chest tightening, something deep inside her loosening for the first time in years. "I do not have a ring," he said. "It was in my mother's trunk in Cheyenne. I never got to fetch it before the weather turned." "I do not care about a ring," she whispered. He stood, walked to the hearth, and pulled a Bible from the shelf. "I can say the vows," he said. "I do not need a preacher to know what I mean." She stood too, heart thudding. Her knees still shook, but it was not from the cold anymore. "Right now?" she asked. "You knocked on my door in a storm," he said. "I will not let you sleep under my roof without my name. I will not let you leave again." The firelight danced on the walls. Celia nodded. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They stood close, hands clasped. Lewis read from the Bible, voice low and steady. When he said, "With this vow I take you as mine," he met her eyes and did not look away. When it was done, he kissed her forehead gently. "You are safe now," he said. "And you are home." Later, when the wind had quieted and the fire had burned down to embers, Lewis pulled the quilt over them both and held her close. Celia tucked her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. She had come to Wyoming with nothing left. But by dawn, she had a name, a husband, and something she had not dared hope for, a future. The morning broke pale and quiet, the storm spent. The snow lay heavy on the roof and fence rails, blanketing the world in stillness. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but the warmth lingered between them beneath the quilt. Celia woke first. Her body ached from the long walk, but her mind was alert, sharpened by the unfamiliar shape of her life now. She turned slightly, careful not to wake him. Lewis lay beside her, his arm resting loosely against her waist, his breath even. In the faint light, the lines around his mouth were softer than she'd noticed before. He looked younger in sleep, though she guessed he was nearing 30. She eased herself from the bed, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. The floor was cold beneath her feet, but the cast-iron stove still held some heat. She added a log and coaxed the flames back to life, then stepped outside to the lean to where the water barrel sat half buried in snow. Her hands burned from the cold as she worked the ladle free. When she stepped back inside, her cheeks tingled with returning warmth. Lewis was sitting up now, feet on the floor, hair tousled. He watched her silently as she crossed the room and poured water into the kettle. "You're up early," he said, voice rough with sleep. "I thought I'd boil water. You said yesterday the pipes don't run this far out." "They don't," he said, pulling on his shirt. "You remembered that from one sentence?" "I remember useful things when I hear them." He stood and moved toward the stove, taking the kettle from her hands. "I'll handle this part." "You've done enough. I wasn't raised to sit idle while a man works." He looked at her, then not surprised, just thoughtful. "Good," he said finally. "I wasn't aiming for idle company." She sat at the table as he worked. A fresh pot of coffee brewed slowly. Outside, the winds had stilled, leaving the windows frosted but clear. The distant hills were blanketed in white, the trees heavy with it. "My mother had a stove like this," she said. "She used to dry orange peels on top." Said the smell made her think of warmer places. Where was she from? Savannah, before the war. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and joined her. "You don't have her voice." "She lost it before I was born. Fever took most of it." "My father said she used to sing." Lewis didn't press, just drank his coffee and watched the snow fall beyond the glass. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It sat like a third chair, solid, honest. "I'll need to ride into town tomorrow," he said after a while. "We'll need to have the papers signed at the courthouse." "I thought you said you didn't need a preacher." "I don't," he met her eyes. "But I want it written down, legal. No one has cause to question your place here." She nodded. "Do folks around here ask questions?" "Sometimes." "They'll stare more than speak, but that'll pass. I can endure stares. You shouldn't have to." Celia turned her gaze toward the fire. Her hands rested on the cup, absorbing its heat. "What about the land?" she asked. "You said in your letter you'd cleared 10 acres. 15 now." "The barn's half done. I've got cattle on lease from a widow in Sweetwater. Her boys couldn't keep up the herd after her husband passed." "You work it alone?" "I did." He paused. "Until now." She looked at him then, really looked. His shoulders were broad, his hands rough and calloused. There was a steadiness in the way he sat, like he carried weight without complaint. "I can sew, cook, keep a ledger," she offered. "But I can learn more," he nodded once. "I'll teach you to ride. We'll start with the brown gelding." He's calm. "You don't think I already know how, do you?" "No." Her mouth pulled slightly at the corner. "But I didn't want to make it too easy for you." He chuckled, low and warm. "Not much about you seems easy." "Not anymore," she said softly. He reached across the table and touched her wrist, gentle and sure. "You don't have to be easy to be wanted." The words landed between them, heavier than anything he'd said before. She didn't flinch from them. Instead, she nodded once and looked down at his hand, still resting on hers. "I'd like to see the barn," she said. "We'll go after breakfast. The snow's packed enough to walk." She rose and moved toward the cupboard. "Then I'll cook." He stood too, but didn't stop her. "There's cornmeal in the tin. And salt pork in the cellar trap." She opened the cupboard door, found the tin, and set it on the counter. Her sleeves were too long, the shirt still his, but she rolled them up and set to work. Behind her, Lewis moved around the cabin, lighting a lantern, pulling on his coat. The rhythm of domestic life began, quiet and certain. By the time the skillet hissed and the scent of cornmeal rose, the cabin felt less like a stranger's shelter and more like the beginning of something solid. Neither of them called it love. But the shape of it was there, soft-edged and growing like the light through the frost-rimmed window. The barn sat low and broad beneath the morning snow, the roofline softened by fresh drifts. The path from the cabin had been cleared just enough for their boots to find earth beneath. Celia stepped carefully, her legs still sore, but she didn't complain. The cold air sharpened her thoughts, and the sun, veiled behind cloud, cast a pale gold over the white blanketed prairie. Lewis unlatched the barn door and swung it open with a grunt. The scent of hay and damp wood met them, warm and familiar. Inside, a bay gelding turned his head, ears twitching at their approach. 2 goats shifted in a pen to the right, and a half-finished stall stood at the far end, its beams propped and waiting. "I thought it would be done by fall," Lewis said, hanging the lantern on its hook, "but the rains lasted longer than they should have." Celia stepped forward, brushing her hand along the gelding's flank. "What's his name?" "Reckon he never had one. He came nameless." She glanced back. "Seems wrong, leaving a creature nameless." Lewis nodded once. "You give him one then." She watched the horse a moment. "Call him Alder," she said. "He stands quiet, but I'd bet he's steady." Lewis looked at her, then at the horse. "Alder it is." He moved past her to the open stall. "I'll need to finish this before calving season. The heifers'll need shelter." "I can help with the frame," she said. "My father let me hold the brace when he repaired our porch. I know how to keep a beam steady." Lewis raised a brow. "You willing to take a mallet to your hands? I already did worse getting here." He didn't answer, but he passed her a small hammer from the wall peg and showed her where the bracing needed to sit. She held the beam as he drove the nail in, her shoulder pressed against the grain, jaw set. When he was done, he stepped back and studied her grip. "You've got a mind to work," he said. "Not just pass time." "I didn't come west to pass time." He nodded, and together they moved down the wall, setting the next brace. The rhythm of the work filled the barn with soft echoes. Outside, the wind had gone still. When they paused, Lewis leaned against the rail. "I never asked what you left behind," he said. "Not the cousin before her." Celia wiped a fleck of sawdust from her sleeve. "My mother passed before the war ended. My father lingered after." He never forgave the world for surviving. Lewis waited. "I was engaged once," she added. "He took a clerkship in Philadelphia and never wrote again. When the letters stopped, I knew. I packed what I had and left." His eyes didn't pity her. "You don't carry softness," he said. "But you carry truth." She met his gaze. "Do you want softness? I want what's real." They stood in silence, the kind that didn't need mending. Celia turned toward the pen where the goats watched her, blinking slowly. "Do they milk well?" she asked. "Well enough," Lewis said. "One of them kicks if you rush her." She crouched beside the trough. "That one, I think, the white one, name's Leela. She looks like she's got opinions." Lewis chuckled once. "She does." Celia rose, brushing her skirt down. "I'll take to them." "I always did prefer animals that earned their temper." He crossed to her, his steps slow. "You'll find plenty of temper in this land, but it gives back if you stay long enough." She looked up at him. "I plan to." He touched her elbow lightly. "Then you'll do fine here." They walked back to the cabin with a quiet between them that no longer felt like distance. Inside, she laid her coat across the chair and he stoked the fire. Later, she sat at the small table, mending the torn hem of her dress with a needle he'd found in his mother's old tin. Lewis stood at the window, watching the light shift over the hills. "When spring comes," he said, "we can plant onions east of the house. The soil's softer there." She nodded, drawing the thread through the fabric. "And beans. My mother said they climb toward hope." Lewis turned, one hand resting on the sill. "Do you believe that?" "I believe in growing things." He crossed the room and sat across from her, elbows resting on the table. "Do you believe we'll grow?" She didn't look up right away. She tied off the thread, bit it free, and ran her thumb along the seam. "I believe we've started," she said. "And I believe in what begins with honesty." He didn't speak again, but his hand reached across the table and covered hers. She let it stay there. That night, when the chill came back and the sky turned dark again, they moved together without ceremony. He undressed slowly, careful not to startle her, and she let her fingers trace the scar that ran along his shoulder, silent in its story. He kissed her like he was learning her language, and she answered in kind. There were no declarations, only the hush of breath and the weight of belonging, earned in quiet, steady hours. Outside, the snow began again, this time gentle. Inside, the fire held strong. By the third morning, the rhythm between them had settled into something quiet and certain. Celia rose before the light broke, slipped into the wool dress she'd mended, and moved without hesitation. The cabin had become a space she knew now how the floor creaked near the stove, which cupboard held the flour tin, the way the door stuck slightly if not pulled straight. Lewis had gone out early to check the fencing along the northern edge, where wind sometimes drove the snowbanks high enough to bury the lower rails. He'd left a note on the table in the form of a single iron nail standing upright in the center, a habit he explained the night before, for when he didn't want to wake her, but wanted her to know he'd be back before midday. She took a wool shawl from the peg and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint wash of amber across the snow-packed hills. In the quiet, she could hear the faint creak of wood from the barn, the distant groan of trees under their white burden. A hawk circled high over the ridge, its cry sharp in the stillness. Inside, she spread the ledger open at the table. The pages were mostly blank, save for a few entries in Lewis's handwriting, dates, notes on feed weather, a short list of items needed from the store in Buffalo. She dipped the pen and began a new entry, her script tight but clean. November 18. Sky clear, fence line due north being checked. Alder took half a bucket. 2 hens laying, she paused, then added, bread flour low, salt to be fetched, the ink dried quickly in the cold air. She closed the book, tied her shawl tighter, and stepped outside again. There was work to be done, and she didn't want to wait for Lewis's return to start it. The henhouse sat behind the barn, a low structure with a slanted roof and thick planks weathered gray. She carried an armful of straw and freshened the nesting boxes, her breath pluming in the low light. One of the hens pecked at her boot, indignant. "Hush," she muttered. "You've got the better deal." A voice behind her made her straighten. "Didn't think you'd wander this far yet." Lewis stood at the edge of the henhouse, gloves tucked under one arm, a dusting of snow across his shoulders. His hair was damp from the walk and a fresh scratch marked his wrist. "You're bleeding," she said, stepping toward him. "Fence post splinter, nothing deep." She took his wrist anyway, turning it gently. "You've got a nail brush in the wash basin." "I'll clean it. I'll do it." He said nothing, only followed as she led him back inside. She lit the lamp and poured warm water into the pan, dipping the brush and working the dirt from the wound. His skin was warm beneath the cold water, his forearm tensing slightly as she worked. "You'll catch worse than this come spring," she said. "I can't say I'm looking forward to branding season. You'll need another hand when it comes. I planned on hiring one from town, but—" She looked up. "But you've got good hands. You learn fast. I wasn't raised to brand cattle. You weren't raised to walk through a blizzard, either." She held his gaze, then dried his wrist with a square of linen. "Then teach me." He stood still a moment, then nodded. "I will." They ate together at midday, salt pork fried crisp, with the last of the turnips boiled soft. Lewis shaved bark from a cedar branch he'd brought in from behind the barn, shaping it slowly with his knife. Celia watched the shavings curl to the floor. "What is it?" she asked. "Handle for the kettle. The old one cracked. You shape it by feel. My father taught me, said a man should be able to mend what he owns." She watched his hands move, slow and precise. "Mine taught me how to listen for lies. Said a woman should know before she's owed the truth." He glanced at her, something shifting in his expression, not pity, not surprise, but something steadier. "Do you hear any now?" he asked. Her voice was quiet. "Not one." That night the wind rose again, though not near as strong. Lewis barred the door and banked the fire. Celia folded the blankets at the foot of the bed, then turned to him, fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve. "I want to learn how to read the sky," she said. "The way you do, know when cold's coming or rain, I'll show you." He set the lantern low. "Come spring, you'll read it better than me." She stepped closer, her hand resting against his chest. "And I want to know how to shoot straight." He nodded once. "Tomorrow I'll set up a target by the corral, and I want to know your mother's name." He looked down at her. "Margaret. She died in the cholera winter of '72. I'll keep her name." He lifted her hand and pressed it to his lips, then rested his forehead against hers. "You're not just here," he said. "You belong here." She said nothing, only leaned into him, her breath steady. They lay together with no hurry, no fear. The light of the fire caught the curve of her shoulder, the curve of his. The silence between them was full of promise, not distance. There would be more storms, more fences to mend, but none of it frightened her now. She had his name, she had his word. And in the marrow of her bones, she knew she was not passing through. She had arrived by December. Snow covered the land in layers thick as quilts, but the cabin was warm, and the rhythm of their life had turned steady. Celia had learned the feel of December wind against her cheek, how it carried a sharper edge than November's, how it sang differently through the pines behind the barn. She no longer asked Lewis what needed doing each day. She simply rose, dressed, and met the work alongside him. That morning, frost clung to the inside of the window, the panes etched with delicate patterns that caught the early light. Lewis stood over the stove, stirring cornmeal into a pot with his usual quiet precision. Celia sat beside the ledger, her hand resting on a folded piece of paper. "I had a dream last night," she said. He didn't turn. "Good one or bad, neither, just true. I was walking through Boston, but the streets were empty and I wasn't afraid." She looked down at the paper. "I think I'm ready to write back." He stopped stirring. "To your cousin?" "No. To the widow in Sweetwater, the one leasing you the cattle. I want to thank her for the heifer she let us keep back." Lewis nodded, setting the spoon aside. "She'll like that. She don't get much kindness returned. I know what that's like." He brought the bowl to the table and set it before her. "You say you're ready. What changed?" Celia folded the paper again. "I stopped feeling like I'd been sent away. Now I feel like I arrived somewhere worth staying." They ate in silence, the kind that filled the room like a second fire. Outside, the wind had softened, and the sky was the color of soft slate. After breakfast, Lewis brought in a sack of oats and left his boots by the door. Celia stood at the basin, washing the dishes with water she'd warmed herself, sleeves rolled up past the elbow. When he passed behind her, he paused and rested his hand low on her back, just for a moment. She didn't turn, but her shoulders eased. That afternoon, he saddled Alder and led her out past the edge of the ridge, where the ground sloped down toward the riverbed. The snow lay crusted over the rocks, but the current still moved beneath, dark and slow. "Water runs under," he said. Even when it looks like it's stopped, she watched the surface, then looked up at him. "That how you see me?" "No," he said. "You're more like the spring runoff. Quiet now, but when the thaw comes, nothing'll hold you back." They rode in silence a while, then stopped near a stand of bare aspens. The sun had shifted, laying long shadows across the snow. Lewis dismounted and reached into his coat pocket. "I meant to do this sooner," he said, drawing out a small cloth-wrapped parcel. "But I wanted to wait till it felt right." She stayed seated, hands resting on the pommel, watching him unwrap the cloth. Inside was a ring, a plain band of silver, worn smooth. "I bought it in Cheyenne the first time I went to sell calves. Told myself I'd keep it till I met someone I'd want to share the winters with." Celia slid down from Alder, her boots crunching in the snow. "You already said your vows, I know, but this is for the days ahead. For the kind of promise you don't say out loud but keep showing up for." She held out her hand without a word. Lewis slid the ring onto her finger, then brought her hand to his chest. "You still feel alone sometimes?" he asked. "Not since you let me hold the brace for the stall." His mouth curved in a slow, quiet way, and he kissed her then. There was no rush in it, no heat meant to distract, just warmth and steadiness and something in it that felt like a home being built. That night, they sat together on the porch wrapped in the same quilt, watching the stars come out one by one. The sky above Wyoming was vast and dark, the stars clear as hammered nails. Celia leaned into him, their shoulders pressed close. "I used to think love was loud," she said. "That it had to be grand, but this is better." Lewis looked out across the hills. "It's the kind you can build on." The days passed like pages turned slow. Celia learned to shoot straight from 50 paces, to mend saddle leather, to spot signs of illness in a calf before it worsened. She wrote to the widow in Sweetwater and received a letter back, written in a careful hand, offering friendship and a bag of early seeds for spring. Lewis taught her how to read the sky, how to watch for high clouds that meant dry cold, or the way smoke hung low before snow. Celia, in turn, showed him how to keep proper records, how to stretch supplies without waste, how to patch a coat so neatly it looked new. Their days were filled with work, but the kind that built something, not just a living, but a life. On a morning near the end of February, they stood together at the pasture fence. The snow had begun to melt, and brown earth showed through in patches. "Spring's early this year," Lewis said. Celia nodded. "You ready for it?" He turned to her, eyes steady. "With you beside me, I'm ready for anything." She smiled, and it was the kind that reached all the way to her eyes, the kind that would have startled the girl she'd once been. "Then let's build something worth handing down." They walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, the sun rising behind them. Years later, the land still held their shape. The barn stood finished, the fields tilled and green. The ring stayed on her finger, worn thinner by time but never removed. They passed their days side by side, raising crops, mending fences, laying new boards when storms took the old. They never spoke much of how they'd found each other. They didn't have to. It lived in the way he poured her coffee each morning without asking, and the way she always left the lamp burning if he came in late from the fields. What they had wasn't loud. It was steady, it was true, and it lasted.